order to be able to help that, that's where you have to find safety. But especially with domestic violence, you can't take someone's complete everything that they use to manage away from them, because what if they're still living in the house? What if a child still has to go to that parent? So the work really has to be done of what in the system, this is what the system is saying, that you have to still go to your parent. So what type of skills do we need to help manage while you're still in the situation, or while you still have to visit the parent or go to parent teacher conferences together? Or so you're absolutely right that it's not just one way. You have to look at where someone's at, their environment, to see what's going to be safe for the situation, and then helping them with where they're at and what they're ready to do.
It brings me back to this thought that I have of where we all have behaviors that we do that we're like, oh, I wish I didn't do that. And hopefully for most of us it's just minor things like where you're watching TV or playing video games or whatever when you should be being productive. But something that I think, I don't know if this is true, uh, but I think that those behaviors are coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms that all of us created at some point in our lives to be able to feel normal. Um,
Manage
and you
anxiety.
know, an- anxiety is everything, but also I'm a very anxious person, so
No, no, no.
that
We all do it. It's normal. That's what I'm saying, not you. But what you're talking about is behaviors that help us manage. Uh, and a lot of times, if you look at it as anxiety, you don't have to be diagnosed or be anxious in order to find ways of doing things that help stabilize us in a situation.
the other thing that this kind of brings me to, and it's a little far afield from domestic violence, but I did want to bring it up because it does tangentially touch, is especially with what we're talking about as survival mechanisms and everything, is that anxiety to me isn't necessarily always a bad thing. It's something that we have to keep us alive. And in the domestic violence situation, very much so to keep us alive, to keep us sane, whatever. And it is difficult for people, I think, to let that go once they get dialed in to that level. And what I've seen from people, and please either of you correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've seen from people is they tend to go one of two ways. They tend to just crash where they're constantly needing a distraction to keep them, I guess, sane. Or the rest time that they need is way more than you might see for somebody else. Or they tend to be immediately turn into the most intense version of the type A person where they're just go, go, go all the time. And it going back to we talked about surgeons, one of the things I learned is that if surgeons have a tremor or whatever, they're taught to move another part of their body, tap their foot, to shake their hips, to do something else to release the tenseness and the energy that they have naturally. And I think, and again, this is just my speculation, I think that that's what happens for people coming out of a domestic violence situation experiencing CPTSD is they're trying to find a way to release what their body has taught them. Hey, your tension level needs to be up here all the time.
Well, that is where like you said, anxiety could also teach us things. It gives us information. But once we are no longer in that scary or the traumatic situation, our body still responds as if it is. And so that is what is hard, because it doesn't matter if it's happening or not. Your body is responding as if it is. And that's where treatment is so important, because otherwise it does, you start to give out after a while, because you're flooded constantly with that feeling that you're in danger. And I think that that is the hard part, with anybody that has been through a trauma. But with them, if we take it back to domestic violence, I sometimes have worked with, after the divorce and then you're in treatment, well, then you see the person for a custody exchange, and all of a sudden you're back having that panic attack, or doing, even though he isn't going to be, he doesn't have the same control, your body doesn't realize that. And that's why it's so important to that somebody that knows how to work with that. And also, there's all these different treatments. Neurofeedbacks, biofeedbacks, another one that helps bring down the reactivity of the brain. But it's so, anxiety isn't bad, but it is when we get stuck in that loop where your body thinks you're still in that situation. That is when it's not good.
And to piggyback off of that, I really, when you were mentioning about how our bodies are like sponges and they absorb that survival mechanism, especially when in a household that behind closed doors, we never know what somebody's experiencing. And I say that because sometimes it's harder for people to leave their home. So, for example, if someone's in treatment while behind closed doors enduring abuse or being a victim in these unfortunate cases, we don't know unless it's disclosed, right? And over the years, reading different articles and learning of different cases, right? I think a common trend that we hear is, I was just surviving, but I want to live. I wasn't living, I was just basically surviving through whatever it was that I was going through. And I think too, physically, there can also become barriers. People might start to experience more headaches and more feelings of fatigue in their body because, like you mentioned, we're sponges, right? If we exercise for prolonged periods of time, we get sore. But when we're in these tense relationships or living conditions, your body naturally tenses up. So we feel it in other areas as well.
And the other thing that is fascinating is about how our brains and our bodies are able, what they do in order to help protect us. And I think sometimes when it's prolonged and intense, what helps save us is then what sometimes is the hard work we need to do to help, calm it down. But the other thing I was going to say too is that, even for people that have gone through things, it can be 20, 30 years later. I know myself, where you think you've done your work and then you get in a situation and you don't even realize that you're responding a certain way, because as life experiences happen, there's nothing wrong with, I don't think anybody is ever fixed or healed, whether you've had trauma or not. You could always learn and grow. And sometimes the most difficult things that we go through, when we take a step back and look, we could also learn the most from. But again, to not put that shame on ourselves just because we went through something, we think we will never deal with that again, and then we get put in a situation that's like, how did I let that happen again? It doesn't matter how educated you are, how much counseling you have, it can happen.
Absolutely. And something that I think too is like there's different resources, not just ones that you would have outreach with for obtaining help, but I think too on social media platforms as well as on different streaming platforms. For example, Netflix, I know in recent years there's been different television programs where perhaps it's a story, not maybe directly similar to one's experience, but maybe something where someone can watch and feel more empowered to be able to step away from that situation of their abuser or see what other resources there are available. Because I think too, sometimes it's harder for someone maybe to, place a Google search or look into different resources because they're potentially nervous of their abuser finding out about their wantingness to escape or have better living conditions for themselves. I can't think of the exact name of the show, but it was brought to my attention as a clinician. It was a show about a female who was in a particular abusive situation and had a small daughter, and she began self-employment, I believe, cleaning homes and
Maid. It's called
maid.
Maid.
That was it.
Andy McDowell's daughter stars in it.
Yeah, and that was a very, I think, empowering show. And I remember a lot of people over social media speaking about that, and just a lot of men and women both coming forward and stating how that was very helpful for them.
I agree with you too, because I think sometimes watching movie, TV, or reading, it's hard for us to observe ourselves when we're in the situation. But a lot of, I know for me, when you start reading and you think, oh my God, this is so familiar, you're able to maybe connect and start putting things together in a different way because it makes sense to you. Something feels, you can see it, but it's not yourself going through it, it's someone else.
It reminds me of a quote that I really like, which is that every happy family looks the same. Every miserable family is miserable in its own way. And I think that applies to domestic violence, especially because even though the patterns are always the same, the story is always incredibly unique. How those patterns started to manifest always seems unique. And I feel like that's why when you have experience with that, a show or media can be so cathartic, empowering, any number of positive words, is because it feels similar, but also distant enough where you can be a part of it. Because I'll be honest, I don't want to watch the story of my own situation. And I doubt most people who are in that or have been in that do, but there is some power and some quality in seeing that story. And again, in knowing that you're not alone, I think is the biggest part of it. But again, that's just take my own thought on it.
I think it's also a good way to educate the general public about it because if somebody's watching a movie and you begin to see that really goes on, obviously it's made for TV or a movie, but this isn't something that's just made up. People do go through this, and educating the public is also an important piece of it.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to talk to somebody who is a good person and say, "Oh, so and so is in a domestic violence situation," and they're like, "Oh, that sucks."
Why don't they just leave? Why would you let somebody treat you that way? It's
And there are a lot of people who have that reaction because it feels like it should be simple.
yes.
And ideally it should be, but it's not, and it never is. And again, shows, movies like that help people to understand that it's not simple. One of the things that I've seen a lot, it happened in my own life. The person I was talking about earlier, it happened, is that abusers are really good at weaponizing children. That sounds terrible, and it is terrible. And if you're in a situation where you have a child with your abuser, it's tough because you are simultaneously trying to protect the weapon that will be used to hurt you.
I've
Um,
a lot of times people say that that's one of the reasons why that they will stay, is because at least I'm in the house with them. If we get divorced, and a lot of times it's 50-50 now, what's going to happen when I'm not there? So that you made a really good point. That's another issue that often will come up.
It's tough. I will say, in my experience, and I know that this is unlikely to translate across, but that an abuser's interest in their kids begins and ends with their ability to use them to harm the person that they're abusing. What I have seen is that when the victim is able to remove themselves from the abuser enough where the abuser can't see the damage that they're inflicting on them through their kids, the interest that the abuser has in their kids starts to wane and they start to go, well, fine, have more custody. As long as I can't see that it's hurting you, then I don't care, which is also damaging for the kid, I think, where you, as a kid, it happened to me, where you realize that your role is for one of your parents is effectively just as a weapon. But at the same time, what we're talking about is you have to get out of the situation, and being able to get out of the situation gives you new options to grow. So that is just, again, that's just my own thought with things. That's been my experience, is that the abuser tends to back off. I don't want to say back off, but tends to lose interest in their children as a weapon when they stop being able to see the results of the damage, if that makes any sense.
It's the reaction, and that's some of the work that I will do of trying to help see that the reaction is what the abuser is looking for. And it's very hard not to react, especially when it's your children. And so how do you stay somewhat neutral too? Because if when a child comes back, you have to be careful. I hear a lot that the behavior is different, or the kids, depending on what happens. And how do you stay neutral in the sense with your child to not feed into it, which is what the other parent wants, and realizing that going to do what he's trying to get a reaction, or she's trying to get a reaction, and that how do you find it in yourself to just that you stay confident in what you have control over. And sometimes it's not a lot because you're in the court system, you're in different systems, but what do we look at? What do you have control over? And that sometimes helps bring down some of that reactivity and the anxiety, which then puts, or she's going to need to find something else to help manage what's going on with him or her.
It's going back to what we've been talking about, it's an incredibly difficult situation, and that is very much by the abuser's design, is to make it as difficult as possible, because I can't speak with 100% certainty, but this is my opinion. What the abuser wants always is a situation where they have absolute control over everything and everyone that impacts their life. And that is by any means necessary of exercise. And that's where you see that, again, in my opinion, that everyone in the life of an abuser becomes the pawn against another victim, if that makes any sense.
It's the way that they're able to relate to people. And one thing I just thought of to go back when we were saying the difficulty of leaving or recognizing is it's not unusual for them either to say that I'm going to call up the place where your parent works and tell them that you did this, or I'm going to send a naked picture of you to your mom, who's the CEO of a big company. They find any way to manipulate the person into doing what they need them to do. And it's far reaching sometimes.
That goes into something that I think is the inverse perception, where people who are successful or who have a lot in their lives, family, a good job, whatever,